What's happening, folks? Back with another reaction, back with some New Order. And as you see here, my copy of Technique, sent by a great friend of the channel, Erik, has arrived. I did want to also give a shout out once again to Chris, who's made available a great deal of New Order, and we will go back to Republic. But given that this takes place right after Substance, which was 87, this is 1988, and Republic was what, 93? I figure we'll go through all of Technique, then we'll jump back forward in time and go through Republic. So yes, thank you to both Chris and Erik and to all those who've been following along. Have you decided what you'd like to do? It would be helpful. So yes, this is I'm imagining a repress. It was in shrink wrap and it's in absolutely pristine quality. So yes, I'm expecting this is a repress, though I didn't yet put in the catalog number or the barcode number to Discogs to find out specifically when it was released. But as I said, major shout out to Erik, who has sent me multiple physical releases, and not just with New Order for that matter. But yes, I believe the first track on here, which I say that because not only does the back outer sleeve not have a track list, but the inner sleeve does not have a track list either. But I looked on Discogs at the master release, and on the on the record label, on the actual record itself, and I believe the first track is Fine Time, which is an interesting title. It sounds like it could be one of a few different things. Of course, on the surface, it's a positive phrase, oh, I had a fine time, which could be a good time, but it also sounds like it could be contrasting it with a particularly good time, or a great time, or an incredible time. It's like, yeah, I had a fine time. It was alright, nothing great, nothing terrible, just sort of in the middle lane. Of course, it could also be sarcastic if things went catastrophically wrong, meaning, oh yeah, I had a fine time, it was great, everything that did, or that could go wrong, did go wrong. So in that regard, I feel like there's any number of possibilities for a phrase that, again, on the surface seems like a positive one. So I'll see what I can catch on a first listen. This is New Order. The album is Technique, and the opening track is Fine Time. Acid squiggle. Oh. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we do have goats, including goats where they're the tempo or the pitch of their, what do you even call that sound that goats make? It's almost like a ba, I guess. Either way, I am really intrigued. Okay, so number one, there was some singing at the beginning, like, actual melodic singing, and that stanza or section of the lyrics seemed to be different from the spoken vocal later, in the sense that the first verse, if I don't know, it wasn't even really a verse, it was like a pair of like call and response or like individual lines. But he's saying like, you're way too young to be part of me or to mess around with me, which would suggest that the sophistication, the maturity of the narrator, he sees it as being on another level, and this other person, maybe because of literal age, but also by extension naivete or just a lack of development, a lack of technique, is just not on his level, and thus he's saying, there's no way this works. There's no way you can engage with me in a way that will be interesting or compelling for me. But then later he was saying like, you've got style, you've got class, and most importantly, you've got love technique. Now, it was a different voice, and so that could just be, a different vignette. It's not necessarily connected to the earlier lines, though if it is, then it sounds like there's been development, there's been maturation, sophistication, and the other party has come back with greater technique and, indeed, ability to love, whether that's, taken more emotionally or physically, maybe some combination thereof. But the fact that the original or the earlier vocals were sung, and it seemed like there were two voices, like there was one part where it's like, you can't you're not on the level to mess with me, or just, I think it was, you can't mess with me. And there was like another voice that had like a follow-up line to that, so I don't know if there's like three people on vocals here, or just like some different delivery styles from one of the singers. But which I say, 'cause I know that like over time Sumner became the lead singer, but I know that like on Movement, for example, we heard different voices, and I suppose if I mention Movement, I must once again comment how different this is. And while I get that that album was made in a very specific context, and they were still putting the pieces back together and, trying to get a sense of how they would go forward sonically, vocally, and so on, yeah, this just feels light years away from that, though not terribly far away from multiple tracks we heard on Substance. And in terms of the sonics, like, it feels like a dance floor remix, like a 12-inch remix, more than like a straightaway synth pop song. It feels like there's a bit of an electro flavor even in some of the sonics. It feels like there could be some breakdancing. I will say there were two parts that it felt like familiar. Like I was gonna say similar. Familiar is what I mean. Like, okay, so it's going along, and again, it's dynamic. There's like this wicked like synth bass chord sequence. There's some, like percussive rhythms, like a wood tap and so on, as well as the steady four to the floor beat. But then a couple minutes in, it stripped everything out, and it was just a beat, and I think like a very light hi hat. So it became very minimal, and I knew it couldn't be over by then because it was only a couple minutes in. So I'm waiting to see what it does, and then right before it brought all the elements back to like the full configuration, there was a quick syncopated part which had this like breakdown computerish kind of sound that felt very familiar. So maybe I've just heard that part on the radio going back years. I mentioned growing up, I listened to K Rock, a pretty prominent Southern California radio station, still around, but in the 80s they were famous for playing synth pop and like, European dance kind of music, and on the weekends they do DJ mixes. So I wonder if I heard that snippet and then, maybe the DJ shifted over to a different record or something. But that felt very familiar. So like in that moment my brain was like, wait, what am I hearing? And I will say, like before I move on, there was a little just acid gurgle. It wasn't super prominent. It wasn't like big in the mix. It wasn't terribly pervasive throughout the whole tune, but there was definitely a little bit of acid work in there. So then it breaks down, then it has that little section that felt familiar, then it brings everything back in, and then there was like almost like a, not orchestral, but I don't think it was just like a guitar, but it was sort of like a guitar-like melodic run, which had a bit of like atmosphere to it, and that part felt very familiar too. So I'm guessing at some point in the past I heard like a snippet of this tune, sections of this tune, but the majority of it didn't feel particularly familiar. So if I did hear it before, I don't think it was the full thing. Either way, as I said, it feels like a dance floor oriented remix, but given that this is the first track on a proper album, I'm guessing this is the original version of the tune, which suggests that they were seemingly going for a sort of, dance floor synth pop meets electro type of sound, which, as I said, is not terribly different from some of the material we heard on Substance. So yeah, a really compelling opener. Looking forward to the rest of the album. Thank you once again to Erik for sending the vinyl and multiple other physical releases. Thank you to Chris for sharing more New Order that we'll go through once we finish this, as well as to all those who've been following the New Order journey for a while now. And from Luca and I will see you next time. Peace.